Welcome my channel. Before we step into one of the strangest and most unsettling stories ever recorded in Mississippi history, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments. And if you're fascinated by real historical mysteries like this one, make sure you subscribe, because bringing stories like this to light takes deep research, careful fact-checking, and hours spent digging through forgotten records. Tonight's story is not folklore, not rumor. It's the chilling case of an 11-year-old enslaved boy whose behavior, knowledge, and survival left doctors, slaveholders, and clergy completely baffled in 1860 Mississippi. From the moment people truly began to notice him, it was clear that this 11-year-old enslaved boy was not like the others. On the plantation, children were expected to work, obey, and remain unseen. But this boy quietly disrupted that order without ever raising his voice or lifting a hand. He spoke little, yet when he did, grown men stopped what they were doing to listen. His words were calm, measured, and strangely precise, as if he were repeating knowledge learned long before his birth. Overseers dismissed it, at first as coincidence or clever mimicry. But the longer he lived among them, the harder it became to explain what he seemed to know. He could identify plants that caused sickness and others that relieved pain, not just by name, but by preparation and dosage, something even trained doctors of the time often struggled with. When asked how he knew these things, he never claimed to be taught. He simply said, "They tell me." At first, people assumed he meant older slaves had shown him, but no one ever stepped forward to claim responsibility. Elderly field hands whispered that some knowledge could not be taught, only remembered. That word, remembered, unsettled everyone who heard it. What disturbed the plantation owner most was the boy's understanding of the human body. After a worker collapsed from heat and exhaustion, the boy calmly instructed others to loosen the man's clothes, elevate his legs, and cool his skin with damp cloths instead of cold water. The man survived. When the plantation doctor arrived hours later, he admitted privately that the boy's actions had prevented shock. When questioned, the boy showed no pride, no fear, only a quiet certainty, as though the outcome had never been in doubt. Even more unsettling was his awareness of events before they happened. He warned one woman not to sleep near the kitchen hearth on a particular night. When she ignored him, a hidden ember sparked a small fire that nearly trapped her inside. He told another man not to ride a certain horse the following morning. That horse threw its rider before noon, breaking the man's leg. Each time, the boy showed no reaction, no sense of triumph or dread. He simply went back to work, as if these warnings were as natural to him as breathing. His intelligence was not loud or boastful. He didn't challenge authority or attempt escape. In fact, he rarely asked questions at all. Instead, he answered them, often before they were fully asked. Overseers began avoiding him, unsettled by the way he would look at them, not with defiance, but with a steady, unreadable calm. Some swore it felt as if he were measuring them, weighing something unseen. One man later said it felt like standing before someone who already knew how your story would end. The strangest part was that the boy had never been taught to read or write, yet he could recognize symbols carved into crates, wagons, and tools. When the plantation owner tested him by pointing to a shipping mark, the boy quietly spelled it aloud. When asked how, he said he had seen it before, though records showed the mark had only been used for a few months. That answer spread fear through the household. Knowledge without learning was unsettling enough, but knowledge without time was something else entirely. Other enslaved people began bringing their sick children to him in secret. He never claimed to heal, but he would place his hand near the child's chest or forehead, listening, breathing slowly, then suggest simple actions: rest, shade, certain herbs, or just time. Sometimes the child recovered, sometimes they didn't. When they didn't, the boy was never surprised. He would sit quietly afterward, staring at the ground, as though mourning something only he could see. What frightened the adults most was that he never behaved like a child. He laughed rarely, never played games, and never cried, not even when beaten. When asked if he felt pain, he said yes, but not in the way others did. That answer spread quickly, changing how people looked at him. Some said he was touched by God. Others whispered he was touched by something else entirely. But no one could deny that his mind seemed far older than his body. Doctors attempted to examine him, checking his head, his reflexes, his speech, searching for signs of deformity or illness. They found nothing unusual, no fever, no injury, no visible abnormality. One doctor wrote that the boy's eyes showed an intelligence inconsistent with his years, a phrase that later appeared in multiple accounts. Another wrote, more cautiously, that the child possessed faculties beyond explanation. That line would later be crossed out in the record, replaced with a single word, impossible. Yet the boy continued on, calm, observant, and quietly aware of things no 11-year-old should have understood in 1860 Mississippi. He never claimed to be special. He never asked to be believed. He simply existed, a living contradiction to everything science, religion, and slavery believed about intelligence, knowledge, and the limits placed on a child born in chains. And that quiet contradiction made him dangerous. Because once people begin to question how much a child can know, they begin questioning how much else they have been wrong about. As stories about the boy spread beyond the plantation, witnesses began to come forward with accounts that directly challenged everything people in 1860 believed about the human body and mind. These were not rumors whispered by frightened laborers alone. They were observations recorded by overseers, doctors, and even visiting traders who had no reason to exaggerate what they saw. Again and again, their testimonies conflicted with accepted medical knowledge of the time, creating a problem no one could comfortably explain away. One of the earliest accounts involved a severe injury that should have crippled the boy for life. While working near a cotton press, his hand was caught briefly in the machinery. Several men heard the crack of bone and rushed over, certain they would find crushed fingers or worse. Instead, the boy pulled his hand free, flexed it slowly, and continued working. By the end of the day, there was swelling but no deformity. Within 2 days, even the swelling was gone. When the plantation doctor examined him, he found no broken bones, no torn flesh, not even bruising consistent with the force involved. He privately admitted that such an outcome defied basic anatomy. Another witness described an incident during a summer heat wave when multiple workers collapsed from exhaustion. The boy, who had been laboring alongside them, showed no signs of distress. His skin was cool to the touch, his breathing steady. When questioned, he said, "The heat moves around me." Those words were dismissed as nonsense, yet no one could explain why he seemed unaffected by conditions that brought grown men to the ground. Doctors at the time believed heat tolerance varied little between individuals, especially children, making his endurance deeply unsettling. Perhaps most disturbing were accounts involving illness. During a small outbreak of fever that swept through nearby plantations, the boy never became sick, despite sleeping among those who were already infected. Even more strangely, witnesses claimed that after spending time near him, some of the sick showed temporary improvement, reduced fever, clearer breathing, only to worsen again later. Physicians insisted this was coincidence, yet privately noted that the timing was difficult to ignore. One doctor wrote that the boy appeared untouched by contagion, a statement that contradicted prevailing theories of disease transmission. His sensory awareness also confused those who observed him closely. He could identify sickness before symptoms appeared, pointing out workers who would later fall ill hours or even days afterward. When asked how he knew, he never mentioned pain or visible signs. He simply said something was out of place. This baffled doctors, who relied on observable symptoms, pulse, temperature, skin color, none of which the boy seemed to need. It was as though he perceived the body in a way no formal science had yet described. Several witnesses remarked on his memory, which bordered on the impossible. He could recall conversations he had overheard years earlier, repeating them word for word. He remembered routes, dates, and events with unnatural clarity, including details no one had intentionally taught him. One trader claimed the boy recited the contents of a shipping manifest after seeing it only once, something that trained clerks struggled to do. At a time when intelligence was believed to be limited by education and race, this created a dangerous contradiction. The church became involved when word reached local clergy that the boy spoke of death without fear or confusion. He reportedly described dying as going quiet and returning as coming back through noise. Ministers questioned him, expecting superstition or childish imagination. Instead, they were met with calm, thoughtful answers that unsettled them deeply. One preacher admitted that the boy's language mirrored theological concepts he had never been taught. Another quietly refused to speak with him again. What frightened people most was not any single incident, but the pattern. His abilities were consistent. They did not fade under scrutiny or fail when tested. No matter who observed him, skeptic or believer, the outcome was the same: confusion. Science offered no framework to understand a child who healed too quickly, endured too much, knew too much, and feared too little. Medical explanations fell apart under repeated observation, and religious explanations only deepened the mystery. Plantation records show that several officials urged the owner to send the boy away. Fearing his presence invited dangerous questions. If an enslaved child could possess such faculties, what did that say about the beliefs used to justify slavery itself? The boy's existence threatened more than science. It threatened the social order. And in 1860 Mississippi, anything that challenged that order was considered a danger. Witnesses eventually stopped writing detailed reports. Language failed them. Phrases like "cannot be explained," "beyond reason," and "inconsistent with nature" appeared again and again. One physician crossed out an entire page of notes and replaced it with a single sentence: "I do not have the tools to understand this." That admission was rare in an era obsessed with certainty. By the time the boy reached 11, his reputation had grown so large that people came just to see if the stories were true. They always left unsettled, carrying the same question with them. How could a child born into bondage possess abilities that contradicted everything science claimed to know? No answer ever satisfied them. And as fear replaced curiosity, the need to explain the boy gave way to a stronger desire to make him disappear, along with the questions he raised. As the incidents surrounding the boy multiplied, curiosity quickly gave way to fear, not among the enslaved, but among the plantation owners, overseers, and men whose authority depended on control and predictability. At first, they tolerated the whispers, assuming the stories would fade. But instead of fading, they grew sharper, more detailed, and harder to dismiss. Every unexplained recovery, every accurate warning, every moment when the boy appeared to know something before it happened chipped away at the fragile certainty that ruled plantation life. And nothing terrified those in power more than uncertainty. The overseers were the first to feel it. These were men accustomed to obedience, to giving orders that were followed without question. Yet around the boy, their voices faltered. He never disobeyed, never spoke back. But something about the way he watched them, quietly, steadily, made them uneasy. Several claimed that when they raised a whip near him, their hands trembled for reasons they couldn't explain. One overseer later admitted that he felt as though striking the boy would bring consequences, though he couldn't say how or why. Fear without a clear source is a powerful thing, and it spread quickly. Plantation owners began noticing patterns they didn't like. Arguments broke out more often. Horses became restless. Tools snapped unexpectedly. Small accidents, a fall, a cut, a broken wheel, happened near the boy with alarming frequency. No one could prove a connection, but coincidence piled on coincidence until it no longer felt random. The owners feared not just the boy himself, but the way his presence disrupted order. Slavery relied on the belief that everything, bodies, labor, even fate, could be controlled. The boy was proof that something could exist outside that control. Rumors made things worse. Some said the boy could see death before it arrived. Others claimed he carried it with him, like a shadow that brushed against those nearby. One story spread that a man who struck the boy later fell from a ladder and died the same day. Another claimed that an owner who demanded the boy be sold lost 2 children to fever within a month. Whether true or exaggerated, these stories fed a growing sense of dread. People stopped speaking freely around him. Conversations died when he entered a room. Silence followed him like a warning. The greatest fear, however, was not supernatural, it was social. Owners worried about what the enslaved population was beginning to think. The boy had not called for rebellion or spoken against his condition, but his mere existence challenged a core lie of slavery, that enslaved people were inferior, less capable, less intelligent. If an 11-year-old boy born into bondage could possess knowledge doctors couldn't explain, what else might be wrong with that belief? What other limits were imaginary? These were dangerous questions in 1860 Mississippi. Meetings were held behind closed doors. Letters were written and burned. One plantation owner suggested sending the boy to a distant county for study, though no one could say what that meant. Another proposed selling him, but no buyer wanted a child surrounded by rumors of death and mystery. Fear had made him unsellable. He was too valuable to ignore and too dangerous to keep. Doctors, once confident in their authority, began refusing to examine him. Clergy who had initially shown interest suddenly found reasons to stay away. When knowledge fails, institutions retreat. And as they retreated, superstition rushed in to fill the space. The boy became a symbol of bad luck, of divine warning, of punishment. People began marking doors with symbols, whispering prayers under their breath when he passed. Rational men found themselves acting irrationally, driven by a fear they could neither name nor control. One incident pushed that fear into something closer to panic. During a routine workday, a sudden collapse claimed the life of a healthy overseer with no prior illness. Hours earlier, the man had mocked the boy openly, calling him a walking lie. Witnesses swore the boy had looked at him just once, with an expression that was neither angry nor afraid. When the overseer fell dead later that afternoon, the connection was immediate in people's minds. There was no proof, no evidence, but fear does not need proof. It needs only timing. After that day, the boy was watched constantly, not protected, watched, as if by observing him closely, they could somehow contain whatever he represented. But the more they watched, the less they understood. He continued his tasks quietly, unaffected by suspicion, unbothered by the tension tightening around him. That calm made things worse. Fear expects resistance or guilt. Calm suggests confidence. Owners began sleeping poorly. Dreams plagued them, dreams of graves, of children speaking with adult voices, of cries echoing through fields at night. Some blamed guilt. Others blamed God. A few blamed the boy directly. And in that fear, a dangerous idea took root, that the simplest solution to an unsolvable problem is removal. If something cannot be explained, erase it. If a question has no answer, silence it. By late 1860, the boy was no longer seen as a curiosity or even a threat. He was seen as a mistake, an error in the natural order. And history shows that when powerful people decide something is a mistake, they rarely ask whether it deserves to exist. Fear had done what logic could not. It united those in power against a single child whose only crime was being impossible to explain. That fear would shape every decision that followed, and it would lead, inevitably, to the moment when the boy vanished, taking his answers with him, and leaving behind a silence far more terrifying than the mystery itself. As fear tightened its grip on the plantation, the final hope for understanding the boy rested with two institutions people trusted, when reason failed medicine and the church. Doctors and preachers were called in not out of curiosity anymore, but desperation. If science or God could name what the boy was, then perhaps he could be contained, explained, and neutralized. But what followed only deepened the terror, because both disciplines failed in ways that were impossible to ignore. The first physician arrived confident, armed with the rigid medical beliefs of the mid-19th century. He examined the boy carefully, measuring his pulse, checking his eyes, tapping his reflexes, listening to his breathing. On paper, everything was normal. Too normal. The boy's heart rate was steady even under stress. His temperature unchanged in heat or cold. His pupils slow to react in ways the doctor could not classify as illness. When questioned, the boy answered politely, directly, without confusion or delay. There was no sign of hysteria, no mental impairment, no physical abnormality. The doctor left frustrated, writing that the child showed no pathology to explain the reports. A sentence that satisfied no one. More doctors followed. One suggested rare resilience. Another hinted at coincidence and exaggeration. A third accused the plantation of superstition. But behind closed doors, their confidence crumbled. They admitted the boy did not fit within any known medical framework. His immunity to illness, his recovery from injury, and his awareness of bodily failure in others contradicted everything they had been taught. One physician, visibly shaken, warned the owner that continued observation would only invite panic. It was the first time a doctor recommended ignorance as treatment. When science failed, the church stepped forward. Ministers believed that if the boy could not be explained by flesh, then perhaps he could be explained by spirit. The first preacher approached him gently, asking about dreams, about prayer, about God. The boy listened, then asked a question of his own. If God knows the end, why are you afraid of the beginning? The preacher later admitted he did not know how to respond. That single question haunted him for years. More clergy came. Some gentler, others more forceful. They tested him with scripture, expecting confusion or fear. Instead, the boy repeated verses he had never been taught, sometimes finishing lines the preacher had only begun. When asked where he learned them, he said he heard them, when it's quiet. That answer unsettled everyone present. Faith was meant to bring comfort, not deepen uncertainty. One minister attempted a blessing, placing a hand on the boy's head and praying loudly for protection and clarity. Witnesses claimed the air in the room grew heavy. The candles dimmed, and the preacher's voice faltered. He withdrew his hand abruptly, later claiming he felt resistance, not physical, but something like pressure pushing back. He never returned. In his personal journal, he wrote that the boy was not unholy, but unresolved, a phrase that confused even his fellow clergy. The most disturbing attempt came when a revival preacher accused the boy of being a vessel for darkness. He shouted prayers, demanded repentance, and called on God to reveal the truth. The boy did not cry. He did not resist. He simply looked at the man and asked quietly, "If I am wrong, why do you keep coming to me?" The question broke the preacher's composure. He left in anger, but his certainty was gone. What frightened people most was that neither doctors nor preachers could agree on what the boy was not. He wasn't sick. He wasn't possessed. He wasn't insane. He wasn't lying. Each failed explanation removed another layer of comfort. If science and religion both failed, then the problem was deeper than belief. It suggested that the world was not as ordered as people needed it to be. Plantation leaders began pressuring doctors to write statements dismissing the boy as coincidence or rumor. Some complied publicly while privately recanting. Clergy began avoiding the topic altogether, preaching instead about humility and silence. When institutions retreat, fear grows unchecked. The boy became a blank space where certainty should have been, and people filled that space with their worst imaginations. Attempts to isolate him followed. Fewer examinations, fewer prayers, less contact, not because answers were found, but because none were possible. The boy had exposed a weakness no one wanted to admit, that there were limits to what could be explained, and that those limits could appear in the form of a child born into chains. In the end, the failure of doctors and preachers did more damage than any miracle or warning ever could. Their inability to explain the boy stripped authority from both science and faith, leaving fear in control. And fear, once empowered, does not seek truth. It seeks resolution. The boy had become a question no one could answer, and history shows that unanswered questions are often met not with understanding, but with erasure. That failure set the stage for what came next. When explanation is impossible, disappearance becomes tempting. And in 1860 Mississippi, the line between solving a mystery and burying it was dangerously thin. The mysterious disappearance of the 11-year-old boy was the final and most baffling chapter in a story that had already unsettled doctors, clergy, and slaveholders alike. By the late months of 1860, his presence on the plantation had become a source of constant tension. Every worker, every overseer, and even the plantation owner felt the weight of his existence. It wasn't just fear. It was a creeping realization that the boy had exposed a limit to human understanding and control. And as much as people tried to explain or suppress the events surrounding him, the boy remained unexplainable. Accounts describe the day of his disappearance as eerily quiet. The usual sounds of work, the cotton being hauled, the horses stomping, men calling to each other, seemed muted, as though the land itself held its breath. The boy was last seen in the morning, tending to small chores as usual, calm and precise, his gaze distant as if he were aware of something no one else could see. The overseer, who had been watching him closely out of both fear and suspicion, later recounted that for the first time he saw the boy pause mid-step, look toward the forest at the edge of the plantation, and smile faintly, almost knowingly. Then he walked away, toward the tree line, and vanished. No one saw him leave the property, no signs of flight were ever discovered, and no footprints led from the plantation into the surrounding countryside. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist. Panic spread through the adult workers first, who feared retaliation from some unseen force, and then through the owner, who realized that the boy's disappearance only heightened the mystery. Attempts were made to search the surrounding woods, to ask travelers if they had seen a boy matching his description, and to inquire of neighboring plantations, but all leads vanished. It was as if he had been swallowed by the very air. Rumors emerged almost immediately. Some whispered that the boy had been taken by angels, that he had been returned to God because the world could not contain him. Others feared a darker explanation, that he had been spirited away, perhaps cursed, or taken as part of some divine punishment for those who had failed to recognize his extraordinary abilities. No evidence existed for any theory, but the uncertainty fueled speculation and dread. People began to tell stories in hushed voices, warning children not to wander near the tree line where he was last seen. His disappearance left the plantation in a state of uneasy stasis. Without the boy, the mysterious recoveries, premonitions, and strange events that had accompanied his presence did not entirely vanish. Some workers continued to report subtle occurrences, tools misplacing themselves, faint whispers at dusk, unexplained chills that ran through the fields. Even without seeing him, many believed that his influence lingered. Some argued that he had not truly left, only shifted into another form of existence, one that defied human perception. Over time, attempts to rationalize his disappearance failed. Medical authorities had no explanation, claiming that the boy's health and survival had already been impossible, and his disappearance only deepened their confusion. Clergy were forced to reconsider their sermons, and in private, some admitted that no amount of prayer or scripture could account for what had occurred. Plantation owners tried to convince themselves that the boy had been stolen, sold, or run away. But every logical explanation clashed with the pattern of events leading up to that day. He had never shown desire to escape, never displayed fear, never indicated that he would leave voluntarily. His absence contradicted every expectation. Witnesses to his final moments insisted that there was something otherworldly about how he disappeared. Some claimed that when he reached the forest, the sunlight bent around him oddly, as if reality itself recoiled from his presence. Others said that a soft cry, like the one that had followed deaths on the plantation, filled the air as he walked toward the trees, but then abruptly stopped, leaving an unnatural silence. These accounts, while anecdotal, contributed to the growing legend and ensured that his story would not be forgotten. The disappearance also had psychological effects on those left behind. Workers who had relied on his knowledge and calm began to struggle with illness and injury that the boy might have prevented. Plantation owners felt a gnawing anxiety, as though a balance had been upset. People questioned not only the boy's existence, but their own understanding of life and nature. For a child to live, heal, and foresee events was one thing. For him to vanish without a trace was another entirely. In the years that followed, his name and story transformed into legend. The boy became a symbol of the unexplained, a reminder that not all mysteries could be solved, and that human understanding has limits. Historians and folklorists debated whether he had been real, whether his abilities had been exaggerated, or whether he had simply disappeared by ordinary means that were lost to history. None could fully account for what had happened. The disappearance of the 11-year-old enslaved boy remains one of Mississippi's greatest unsolved mysteries. It was a moment that marked the end of one chapter in the plantation's history, but opened an eternal question about the boundaries of human knowledge and perception. He had lived in a way no one could explain, and he left in a way no one could explain, ensuring that his story would haunt the memories of those who had witnessed it and the imagination of anyone who later heard it. A boy who defied the laws of nature, reason, and authority, and whose vanishing left a silence as powerful as his life had been.